Hello everybody, Jake Raby here, Flat 6 Innovations. Want to welcome you back to yet another video in our technical series, a focus on IMS bearing failure. This will be part 4 in the series, and in today's video, we're going to disassemble this failed engine that suffered an IMS bearing failure at 29,000 miles. So in today's video, we're going to focus on getting the engine apart, taking it apart, loosely showing you the order that's done in, showing you briefly some of the things that we find as far as failed items that happened along with the IMS bearing failure, because what really determines the salvation of an engine and what we're going to end up keeping or throwing away as part of this process is the collateral damage. Those secondary and tertiary failures that stem from this single row 6204 IMS bearing failing at 29,000 miles. Now, when a bearing fails like this, that collateral damage, the secondary, the tertiary damage, that is what costs the money. That is what takes out pistons, takes out valves, can take out cylinders, can break a lot of things inside the engine. That is why when you suffered any kind of an IMS bearing failure, you don't want to simply go in, replace the bearing, leave all the debris-laden components damaged inside, and put it back together. That's not what we do here at Flat 6 Innovations. That's not what we condone. I would never recommend somebody doing that. We see a lot of people that suffer an IMS bearing failure like this. They believe they can simply extract the failed bearing, put another bearing back in its place, clean up some debris, and put the engine back together. That is an owner's worst nightmare. That is also a buyer's worst nightmare, because most people who do that aren't doing it to keep the car. They're doing it so they can sell you the car without telling you that it suffered this failure, and then you find out the hard way. So here at Flat 6 Innovations, that's not what we do. So the thing that we do is we take this engine completely apart, and there is a huge list of items that we throw away, whether they're good or they're bad. And that is one of the major differences in the Flat 6 Innovations engine program. Not just the fact that we pioneered these engines, not just the fact that I invented the IMS solution and we had developed all the tools to extract these bearings, we developed the procedure to extract the bearing and to follow up with all the things that we need to do to make these engines live. All those things aside, what we've learned is what not to do as much as what to do. And that means things like timing chains, timing chain guide rails, a lot of bolts and nuts and hardware, even some major components are thrown away as part of this process. We throw those parts away whether they're good or they're currently bad. So what makes somebody have a kind of an understanding of an engine rebuild is they think that they go in and you replace what's bad. That's what a lot of mass producers would do. They would only replace exactly what is currently bad. You'd put a lot of new parts in, but people tend to not think about the parts that are currently good. They still have time on them. They've also seen trauma. So they would tend to keep those parts because they currently are good. When they look at those parts today, the snapshot that they take of them is currently good. But my question is, are those components going to end up living as long as the things that we put into this engine that we've developed along with Ellen Engineering? That's a question mark that I don't like. And that's the reason why a lot of things we throw away, whether they're good or bad. So recently, we took one truckload of parts to the salvage yard that was just basically pieces of these engines that we had disassembled, and that was 8,000 pounds. That was about 14 months or so of scrap that we got from taking core engines apart, customers' engines apart. So that's a lot of pieces, that's a lot of weight. So this process begins with taking the original engine that came out of the car, breaking it all down, doing a good component inspection, which is going to be the focus of our next video in the series, is going over exactly what failed, why it failed, what else it could have taken out with it as it failed, what else it could have damaged that we need to look further into, and also the things that we're going to do to move forward have to be taken into consideration at this time as well. And one thing that I always do is we never throw anything away until an engine is completed. We'll always keep that stuff. We keep it somewhere. We keep it on a cart. We organize it somewhere with that customer's name on it, because we never know when we may have to go back and look at it during assembly to see if something we noticed during assembly adds up to what happened with the failure. So we also never know when we need to reference a part out of this engine to compare it to what we're going to be replacing it with. That's a big problem for first-time builders. They'll take an engine apart and they'll throw all the bad stuff away. They don't keep anything for reference. So when the supplier sends you the wrong length timing chain and you don't have anything to go compare it against, then you end up putting the engine together with a wrong timing chain. That's a big novice mistake, and we've seen people that are even seasoned engine builders make that mistake. So as I instruct my classes with a knowledge group and all the hands-on stuff that we do and all the online training we do, I tell people, never throw those parts away until the engine is in the car and completed. These are all critical things that my engine program addresses. We don't mass produce, we always build the customer's engine, and we always keep the original engine with the car. Now there are instances where an engine has so much collateral damage, it saw so much trauma, that we may decide it's not best to keep this core engine, the core being the heart of what we're going to work with, the foundation, if you will. In those cases, we have to source a core from our core bank if we have one. A lot of engines like the 3.8 Carrera S, the M9721 engine out of the Cayman S, a lot of those are very difficult to find cores because they all have major problems, and most of them end up leading to a traumatic engine loss where we don't have a core to work with. So some of those cores will end up creating a bit of a challenge for us here at Flat 6. So again, M9603 engine. Now this engine would be used in everything from a 2002 up to a 2005 996, okay? So I always throw that 2005 thing in there because we've actually seen some of these vehicles that were branded a 2005 that were not a 997, they were a 996. That confuses some people sometimes. But this engine was used through that series. This base engine, the short block if you will, was also used in the 2004 996 40th Anniversary Edition X51. There was a special version of this M9603 engine that was used in those particular cars. But it had different cylinder heads, it had different camshafts, different intake manifold, and some other pieces as well. But the heart of it, the actual internals of it, were no different than the engine that you're going to see here. So as we move forward, we'll be referring to this engine as a 3-chain. That means it has 3 timing chains. It has one that goes from the crankshaft down to the intermediate shaft and provides mechanical drive for it. It has another pair of chains that goes out to cylinders 1 through 3 or cylinders 4 through 6. That would be respectively bank 1 and bank 2. You'll hear me talking a little bit about that as we move forward, okay? So now we're going to start this process by getting rid of all of this junk on the outside of the engine. And this junk, if you will, is what makes this engine what we call a black box. This is the wiring harness, the intake manifold, power steering pump, all of these things that are ancillary components. Okay, we're going to get those out of the way, and you're going to notice we're going to leave these pieces in as much of an assembly as we can. We're going to try to leave the intake manifold most of the way together. We're going to try to leave a lot of these things together as much as we can. And if you do this at home, you want to do the same thing. The main reason we do it here is to make sure it's easy to store on our storage carts and things like that, because we're going to break it all down and clean it ultrasonically before it goes back on the new engine. We have to get all the debris out of it, all the dirt off of it. We make this engine look like it was literally brand new. but we want to do that work as we're doing the assembly, not now, because if we cleaned it now, it's just going to get dirty again. So we try to leave it in as big of parts as possible so we can store it away. Once we get all the ancillaries off the engine, it'll actually look like a long block. That's what it'll actually be. And with it being a long block, you can see more of the mechanicals that we're going to be taking apart. Now, I also want to say that we're working on another video that's going to be one of the videos that we sell, okay? And that video is going to go over another engine that we have taken apart, and that is going to actually go in association with our focus on M96 or M9X engine assembly, okay? Last year I shot a big video series, 15 hours of edited content, and that 15 hours goes through building an engine like this one from A to Z, okay? We never did a teardown of that, so now we're going to add a supplemental video to that series. So if you're very interested in what it takes to take one of these engines completely apart, okay, that will be a good video for you to buy from the knowledge group here in the next few months, or weeks actually, because we're pretty close to having that one finished now. So this will just be a brief overview of taking the engine apart, doing brief component inspection. Then our next video, we're going to do the in-depth component inspection, showing you exactly what failed, what we're going to throw away, what we're going to keep, and setting the stage to build this into an R40 Stage 2 street and track performer by Flat 6 Innovations. Okay guys, so now I've kind of dismembered this beast. We've got all the ancillaries off of it, all those things that make it into what we call the black box are gone, and now we just have a bare long block to work with. So at this point, what you have to understand, whether you have a Boxster, whether you have a Cayman, whether you have a 911 derivative, either a 996 or a 997, what's underneath all of that stuff will always look basically like this. If your car's 97 to 2008 and one of those Porsche submodels, you're basically going to have this to work with. So I don't want somebody to think that this video is only pertaining to a 996. It'll pertain to a 997. It'll pertain to a Boxster. It'll pertain to a Cayman. All of those are basically the same from this point inward. Now, of course, we got displacement changes, camshaft changes, all of that. But the basic foundation, the basic construction in the engine design is going to be the same. Same intermediate shaft, no matter what bearing it may have fitted to it, the shaft is basically the same, other than the housing bore that holds the actual bearing, okay? So I think it's just important that we set that forward, or set that straight moving forward, because it can be kind of confusing. Boxster guys don't think this engine's like theirs, okay? But if you had an M96-24 Boxster engine, which would basically be 2003, 2004, you would have almost this exact same design of engine. It's still a 3-chain, okay? Still has the same IMS bearing problems and shares a few of the modes of failure of this M96-03 engine for this 2003 996, okay? So now that we've got it down to the long block, we're going to start pulling things off that are more deeply mechanical. So we're going to start this process by removing the camshaft cover and the Valvetrain components from bank 1. Then we're going to come straight over to bank 2 and do the same thing. Once we've got the Valvetrain components out of the way, we're going to keep those kind of partitioned, bank 1 to bank 2. And then we're going to remove the cylinder heads and a couple other things. So I want you to understand we're doing this in a little bit of a different order than we would if it was going to be not for a video that we're going to try to present to you guys, okay? So typically I would go ahead and get the oil sump opened up and some other things like that. That tends to make a bit of a mess. Even though we are at the morgue here at Flat 6 Innovations, we want to keep things as clean as we can, so it will help keep the focus on what we're doing versus having a mess everywhere, okay? So we're going to pull bank 1 apart, pull bank 2 apart, then we're going to pull that sump plate off later in the stages than we normally would. Now, if you remember, we already pulled the sump plate off and pulled the oil filter housing apart to inspect it while this engine was still in the car. We did that in part 2 of this video series. So we already know what we're going to find in there. We just stab those pieces back on to keep from having the Exxon Valdez all over the floor of our morgue here. Even though it's a morgue, we still keep it clean. So we're making progress. So basically at this point, we've got the Valvetrain components from bank 1, Valvetrain components from bank 2 have been removed. We got the lifter carriers, lifters, all those items, variable valve timing, everything else is out of the way. The next step is going to be removing the cylinder heads. We'll start by doing bank 1, then we'll come to bank 2. When we get to that point, we'll be able to look at our cylinders and some other things in this engine to see if maybe this engine was seeing more damage than what we thought. So a lot of people think these engines have to be mismaintained, they have to be abused, something has to go on to create this. That couldn't be further from the truth. Just like this original owner, 29,000 miles, he did what he was supposed to do. He followed the owner's manual. He followed what he was told to do. Now, in a future series here, actually a part of this series, you're going to get to meet the owner of this car, the prior owner of this car, that is. He wants to be a part of this, so he's going to come tell you what it was like to buy the car, drive the car, own the car since 2003, and then suffer this particular fate. And that basically resulted in him selling the car instead of repairing it, okay? So cylinder heads will be the next thing to come off, and then we're going to get deep in the heart of this thing to see if we had more failures going on than what we actually anticipate. Moving forward with disassembly, making some significant progress with this M9603 engine. We now have the cylinder heads off. The first thing we noted, as typical with an IMS bearing failure, is collateral damage. That collateral damage is basically, at this point, defined as piston to valve contact between the pistons and exhaust valves on both bank 1 and on bank 2. This is normal and expected from an IMS bearing failure, especially with a 3-chain engine. Now, this engine clearly did not run very long with this damage. However, it appears that somewhere along the line, somebody diagnosing this, or possibly the vehicle owner when the failure actually occurred, tried to restart this engine. The reason we can tell that is because typically on a light IMS bearing failure, you're only going to have piston to valve contact on bank 1. This one has it on bank 2 as well. Now the reason for that is because the anatomy of this engine actually drives the bank 1 camshafts from the aft end of the engine, the flywheel end of the engine, okay? The opposite end of the intermediate shaft is what actually drives bank 2. So typically when we have bank 1 only piston to valve contact, it's because the intermediate shaft has lost control because the bearing is disintegrated, all the balls have fallen out, everything is disconnected, if you will, and that IMS shaft will shift over toward bank 1, instantly retarding those valve timing events. Now it occurs at such a rate, or basically enough degrees of crankshaft rotation, that you will have that retarded valve timing event lead to those bent valves and piston to valve contact on bank 1. The fact that this one had it on bank 1 and bank 2 tells me that somebody didn't know what they didn't know and they tried to restart the engine. Now from an owner's perspective, that would be the natural thing to do. The owner of this vehicle didn't even know an IMS bearing failure existed. He didn't keep up with all the things out there. He didn't keep up with any of the videos we've done. He didn't even know we existed until everybody told him to call us for obvious reasons after the engine failed, okay? So he didn't know what he didn't know. Maybe he tried to restart it, or maybe somebody trying to perform a diagnostic tried to restart it. We'll know further about that once we interview him here in a future video in this IMS series, okay? So we did see that piston to valve contact. We did find some debris. We don't notice any massive cylinder scoring at this particular time, which where the engine is now, we really can't see that because we still have the pistons installed. So now we're going to work to remove the water pump, the front console, the oil sump, okay, on the bottom of the engine, and then we're going to work to remove this bank 2 crankcase half from the bank 1, and that's the time we'll take the next break and kind of go over what we're finding as we progress through this disassembly of the M9603 engine that suffered the IMS bearing failure. Okay, so I've just removed the bank 2 block half. Basically, this is the crankcase for the bank 2 cylinders, and I just pulled that off and left the pistons actually in place. I'm looking at them quickly here. Nothing is jumping out at me from a bore scoring perspective, which is a little bit surprising based on what we've been seeing with so many of these low mileage engines that are having bore scoring very early on. So this one doesn't have anything that is tremendously bad. I see some scrape marks, a little bit of streaking, nothing that's bad. It's not progressed even to what I would call stage 2 based on my cursory overview right here and what I've seen with everything still kind of dirty. Usually bore scoring is going to jump right out at me. I'll find that real quickly and be able to kind of condemn things at that point in time. That's another basic fact that helps us substantiate that this owner did do everything right. He did service the engine the way it should have been. He was a good owner and was able to basically mitigate all the big problems we see with bore scoring based on the way he was able to drive the car. So I'm looking at the top of these pistons now, and here on number 6, you can't really see it in the video. I want to try to turn this a little bit so you can see it. We do have some pretty significant loss of the piston skirt coating, okay? So this was going to lead to bore scoring because we've already learned that the first part, what really starts that bore scoring to occur, is a loss of the piston skirt coating that allows you to have that metal on metal contact between the 2 aluminum surfaces, basically. The lock-a-sil of the cylinder, which is just localized silicon, and the aluminum piston that has this coating on it. So what leads to the bore scoring is this, okay? So we do see that we have something that would lead to bore scoring. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to clean up the block half, and I want to see if I notice an increased bit of wear in that cylinder bore on number 6 that will match up to the location of this loss of the skirt coating, okay? When we clean things up, we start to measure them. What looks good right now might not be. So, you know, at this point in time, this entire engine is what I consider guilty until proven innocent. Everything here has the potential to cause us a problem later down the road, so we've got to look very closely. We've got to measure. We've got to do visual inspections. Sometimes we do Magnaflux inspections to look for cracks and things like that according to where the damage may be, okay? So I'm going to roll this kind of back around here. And I see a little bit more collateral damage, and that is we've had the tensioner paddle snap in half. So this is the intermediate shaft bearing or intermediate shaft timing chain, if you will, the large internal tooth chain. This is what keeps it tensioned, all right? And this is broken in half. Now this is typical collateral damage stemming from the IMS bearing failure, okay? We've also seen this before go unnoticed. So let's say you were of the mindset of, okay, this engine had a light IMS bearing failure. Just the bearing failed. This mindset gets people in trouble all the time. They don't know what they don't know until the entire engine comes apart like this, okay? This one got by us on our cursory inspection to begin with, really because we weren't looking for it, but there was no big symptoms of this. There was none of this in the sump plate, as you saw, okay? So let's hypothetically say that this engine had a light IMS bearing failure. We are going to basically be bushers. We are going to remove the IMS bearing in its entirety. What's left of it is in the intermediate shaft, and we're going to think that we can just replace that bearing, and there's none of this problem out there. Okay, this is what inexperience does. So somebody wants to try to save the engine, they just throw a cheap bearing in it, they restore function. In this case, they would spend a lot of time only to find out that this intermediate shaft tensioner paddle, which is the second part that is installed when this engine is assembled, and the second to the last that is removed when the engine is disassembled, they would think this part is okay. They would cut that bearing out, go through all kinds of crap. They would think they're saving it. They would think they're going to be cheap. There's no such thing as a cheap Porsche. And they would learn that when this bit them in the ass. They tried to put the IMS tensioner back in, or they wonder why it cranks up and it jumps timing immediately. This little jewel right here will bite them. I've had people in my classes that have had this happen to them. I've had customers that we've dealt with that have went to the wrong shop. They go to somebody, even maybe very well experienced with Porsches. They don't know what they don't know. They haven't focused on just this engine. They let this get by them. Then that person has to come to us. We bail them out. We take the whole entire engine apart, which is what should have happened the first time, and things are saved the right way through a Flat Six Innovations engine reconstruction, okay? But again, this is a part that broke as a result of a loss of control of the intermediate shaft because the bearing failed, okay? So again, this is another reason why you never, and I repeat, you never simply replace an IMS bearing that has failed. You never just replace the bearing. You got collateral damage pieces. You got plastic and metal, aluminum, steel floating around inside the engine. Those things are going to come back to bite you. You notice I said they are going to bite you. It is going to happen. It is just a matter of when, where, and how much money it is going to cost you to try to fix that mistake. So now that we've substantiated that fact and we've talked about that bit of collateral damage, I want to go over what else I see here. So I've got some pieces of debris. This could be the ferromagnetic parts that come from the bearing cage, or also the snap ring. We already found some chunks, and most of the snap ring that holds the IMS bearing in, we found those early on when we took bank 1 apart. A lot of this debris will be transmitted over to bank 1 because the bank 1 timing chain actually will act like a conveyor belt. So any of these pieces that are back here, they get slung up against that chain, the chain will collect them and move them over to bank 1. As a general rule, doesn't mean it's going to happen that way every time, but most of the things you're going to find are like that. So moving right along, I also see a ball bearing laying in here, some other pieces of debris. Here's another piece of the snap ring actually, right here, okay? So you can see how much metal is in this thing. There's metal everywhere. If somebody would have tried to patch this up, even if this thing didn't bite them in the ass, all this other debris would take this engine out. Engines cannot live with debris inside them, guys. They are precision devices. They have tolerances within 1/1000th of an inch. They cannot live with their lifeblood, which is the oil, basically collecting metal debris, suspending that in the oil, and then transmitting it through all the other internals. It doesn't work that way. I don't know what you know about engines, but it doesn't work that way. No different than slicing your wrist open, dumping in some mercury. How long are you going to live, right? Same thing. So now what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and continue on with disassembly. The next portion of this, we're going to remove the crankshaft carrier kind of in its entirety from the crankcase, okay? We're going to then disassemble the crankshaft carrier and lay all the pieces out in the order they come, okay? And we're organizing all these components from bank 1 and bank 2, so in our next segment of this video series, we can go over component inspection with you, both from a normal wear perspective as well as from a collateral damage perspective, to see what was wearing, what wasn't wearing, what could be reused, what we would never reuse, and what we are going to throw away, whether it's good or bad, because our reconstruction program is that comprehensive. So stick with me, we're going to zip the rest of this thing apart. I'll come back with a basic overview once everything is apart. So now we have the heart of the engine dissected here on this work table. And of course, the heart of any engine is the crankshaft. And this crankshaft looks beautiful, 29,000 miles. The engine failed so instantaneously, it does not appear that we have any collateral damage that had made its way all the way out to the crankshaft and the bearings, if you will. The main bearings look very good. We're still going to throw them away. We're not going to reuse those. The connecting rod bearings, on the other hand, are showing a little bit of signs of some wear patches, and you can see these here. These particular wear patches are something that we see in engines that have basically followed the factory directives for oil type, variety, viscosity, and all those sorts of things. Even here at low mileage, this is a significant wear patch in this connecting rod bearing. Now, one thing we've always known that played into this was fuel selection. Fuel quality, if the fuel is kept nice and clean, if the fuel is constantly circulated, meaning the car is constantly driven and filled with fresh fuel, what we see is this wear patch actually is aggravated by nothing more than detonation. As we have strong cylinder pressures, things like that, the need for good clean octane and good clean fuel comes into the combination there, and that actually can lead to some detonation or pre-ignition, if you will, that actually leads to wear of these connecting rod bearings. If you notice, these two wear patches are in the exact same place in both of these rods. This was the same across the board on all 6 cylinders, and we see this in almost every engine that we pull apart. This is fairly advanced for a 29,000 mile engine. At this point in time, I do feel that this is wear that was not a collateral damage type issue from the IMS bearing failure. Debris did not cause this. This is a wear patch that we see all the time, even in engines that are electively built, okay? So if we look on the other side of the rod bearings that come from those particular connecting rods, you don't see that, okay? This is on the non-loaded side of things. This is the other side of the connecting rod bearing, if you will. So we got these right here. This is how this goes together, okay? And there's not much load down here. So we almost always see the wear concentrated directly underneath this beam. The piston is here. It's actually forcing the load down mechanically through combustion pressures, things like that, and it puts most of that load in that wear patch right under that beam, okay? Again, I don't think that debris caused that. We see it all the time. This rod bearing, you know, if you were a copycat imitator that wanted to save money on somebody's rebuild, you could reuse that, okay? But some people might even reuse the ones on the top, but that's not what we're going to do. So next, I'm going to grab this IMS tensioner paddle. This is basically that broken part that we saw as our collateral damage as we've been taking this engine apart. This is a component that we upgraded back in 2008. I had one of these things break in operation. It did not have any collateral damage that created that failure. It was one of my reconstructed engines. Since then, for all of our track engines, our stage 2s, all the engines that are greater than a stage 2, we do replace this with a billet aluminum item that we developed in conjunction with LN Engineering, of course. And that particular component is light years stronger than this one. We've seen those live through IMS bearing failures and not break like this, okay? So that's something that you can always upgrade to if you want to. Now this engine is going to be based on my Stage 2, but it's the R40 derivative, meaning it is a street and track performer. It is the 4-liter. It's not the standard Stage 2. It is the R40. So it's going to have upgraded Valvetrain components. It's going to have this tensioner paddle. It's going to have a lot of other things in it that a standard Stage 2 doesn't have. That's because it's going to make even more performance, more horsepower, more RPM than a standard Stage 2. It's not for everybody. Not everybody needs it. Not even most track guys need it. But I'm going to go kind of crazy with this car because I think that a 29,000 mile car that's black, it's a C2, it's a 6-speed, it's an epic vehicle, it's beautiful in every way, it's getting ceramic coated. You know, for the extra money it costs to go ahead and do the R40, I figure what the hell, we're going to do it. And when this car is sold to its new owner, after we sell it on Bring a Trailer auctions, they're going to get something that's even more unique than most of what we build. It's coming here from the Flat 6 Innovations Custom Shop. So in our next video in the series, we're going to go over all this stuff in depth. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. There's just a couple of things jumped out at me that I wanted to show you. Again, the crankshaft is beautiful. This will be dynamically balanced along with all the rest of the rotating and reciprocating components that make up our dynamic mass. And we're going to also polish this. We're going to have it Magnaflux tested, make sure it's not cracked, anything like that. This will be one of the major components that we are going to reuse. Even things that we reuse are always checked and they're not assumed to be good, okay? So you assume nothing and you quantify everything in engine building. That's what makes the Flat 6 difference. I treat these cars like they have wings, not like they have wheels, okay? When you build an aviation type engine, you don't leave anything to look good and just base it off of a visual type of inspection, okay? You always make sure that it's good on the inside as well as good on the outside. So the crankshaft looks good, we're going to make sure that it's good. So we have these thrust or end thrust shims that are part of the crankshaft carrier assembly or sub-assembly, if you will. These are here to set up the end thrust of the crankshaft in its carrier, okay? Just to show you how good this engine looked inside from many perspectives, there's no wear on these. So this tells me that this driver didn't sit at a traffic light or didn't sit at a stop sign with his foot on the clutch. If he did that, we see wear in this aftmost one of these shims. Because when you put your foot on the clutch, you're putting all the 2,000, 3,000 pounds of pressure from that pressure plate directly on this. As your foot's on the clutch, it's totally loading this particular shim. Now the one on the other side doesn't see wear from that, doesn't see load from that. It's actually being forced the other direction from it. So when I see one of these that has hardly any scuffing on it, this guy knew how to drive a manual, okay? And he's known how to drive a manual for a long time. So again, a good Porsche driver knows how to drive a car, and I can sit here and tell you that he knew what he was doing. So the last thing that I want to show you is, of course, the infamous intermediate shaft, the IMS, okay? So as I've gone over in some of my other videos, this is comprised of 4 components that are basically put together with a hope and a prayer from the factory. There's no keyways, there's no swedging, there's no mechanical locking, there's no pins, there's no welding. From the factory, there's nothing to hold this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece together. One of the things we do with all of our engines is we have these pinned, or sometimes we will weld them, where we fasten all this stuff together permanently, okay? That's something that we developed over the years, and LN Engineering started offering that as a service to other people that were building their own engines, because these drives can actually work loose. That's not an IMS bearing failure, but it's something that can happen when these pieces decide they want to disconnect. I've had a couple of engines fail from that over the years that we had built. Of course, you build as many of these engines as we do. You put them through the rigors we do. Some guys have got 250 track hours on one of these things. You're going to have things happen. So we learn from those things, and we basically make that improve with all of our engines. So everything that we've been doing over the last decade at least has had these all pinned and put together with some form of mechanical fastening. But what you see here, this is the actual where the IMS bearing resides, IMS housing bore, and this shaft is junk, okay? We see a lot of people patching these things up. This shaft basically cost about $1,200 in most cases. A used one's $1,000 sometimes. And we see people that are doing all kinds of stuff trying to rebuild this shaft, trying to overcome this to save that money. What we're going to do with this, in the video we're going to shoot next, I'm actually going to crush this with one of my tanks. I'm going to make this where nobody can ever reuse it again. Because I think that it's junk, and I don't think that anybody should ever be offered the ability to reuse something that's seen this kind of trauma. So that being said, we're going to close out this segment from the morgue here at Flat 6 Innovations. We're going to get prepared so we can shoot the next video in the series that's going to go over exactly what the component inspection revealed to us. We're going to get together all the things that we're going to keep. We're going to get together all the things we're going to throw away. And we're going to make sure the things that are thrown away can't be returned as a recycled sometime down the road.